Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I'm Jack Ide. On today's show, The Wild After Wildfire, evolving our response to fire. Host Carrie Kim will be interviewing Maya Khosla, wildlife biologist, writer, poet, and filmmaker. Maya Khosla, working in collaboration with other scientists, investigated the post-fire regeneration of giant sequoias. As Sonoma County Poet Laureate between 2018 and 2020, she brought Sonoma's communities together to heal through gatherings, field walks, and shared writing after the wildfires that struck those communities. After surveying forests of the Sierra Nevada, she created a short documentary film, Searching for the Gold Spot, about wild places that experience rejuvenation and supporting high biodiversity after wildfire where they are not logged. Her work has been featured in For the Wild and in the film Elemental Reimagine Wildfire. We begin with a clip from Maya Khosla's film, Searching for the Gold Spot, The Wild After the Wildfire.
An ancient force continues to shape our forests of the American West. Generations of life linked to fire for eons. Post-fire forests are increasingly rare because they are routinely removed by logging operations. Keen to study life after wildfire, teams of biologists are venturing through our national forests.
So I just kind of wanted to show you. Now we're in the subplot. We're actually heading further into it. Well, Rocky just came out with a...
They will compare burned forests with those that have not experienced fire in recent times.
Yeah.
Their work is to search for another rare bird, the black-backed woodpecker. Black-backed woodpeckers were once common in the Sierra Nevada Cascades region. They have recently been petitioned for listing as a bird to be protected by the Endangered Species Act.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, today we welcome wildlife biologist, writer, poet, and filmmaker Maya Khosla on the show to help us better understand fire and how we create intimacy with the landscape of fire. Fire is on the hearts and minds of many, especially locals, given the recent Eaton and Palisades fires, among others, in recent years. Maya Khosla joins us to ruminate aloud and share her experiences documenting and writing about fire ecology and post-fire forests, as well as the caveats of how we respond to fire and the potentialities. Often the post-fire forest is cleared for logging, even when the trees are still alive, with potential to thrive and serve biodiversity. After fire, what remains? Do we kill what is still alive, or do we embrace fire as a catalyst, ushering in life and biodiversity to the ecosystem? Wildfires and urban fires are urging us to transform our behaviors and relationship to fire. Do we fear fire or respect it? How are we contributing to the emergence and intensity of fires? What should our response to fire be? What is our responsibility to fire and the many living beings who thrive in its wake? Indigenous peoples and the earth have evolved with fire for countless eons. Now is the time for modern humans to rediscover our interdependence with fire, to align with fire and forests for the benefit of life. May we heighten our awareness, open our eyes and hearts, and support nature as it organically evolves. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their continuing presence, legacy, and stewardship of this region. Our show comes to you from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. We invite you to go beyond land acknowledgments to action. Volunteer on Indigenous restoration projects, donate to Indigenous causes and the Land Back movement, reach out to local tribal councils and see how to help and uplift Indigenous peoples wherever you live. Welcome, Maya. We are so grateful for your voice and presence on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are so thrilled to have you sharing your lived wisdom, your wonderment and perspectives on fire and fire ecology. And I think this will be a life-affirming show after everything that people have gone through here in our region, in a way that respects and helps us understand the wants of nature. So, I wanted to open with a quote from you in the film Elemental Reimagine Fire. Once fire goes through, people just assume nothing is there, that it is destroyed. But that's not true at all. It's like waves upon waves of new life coming in. I love that quote from you. It was amazing. It was perfect. It was like right after, we were still in the fires actually, but I wonder if you could elaborate on this for anyone who might be in that bleakness and that state of kind of death versus life after fire moves through, just the way they are seeing the world.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of my experience of fires and post-fire explorations has been in the Sierra Nevada and also in my home county, which is Sonoma County. In both places, what I've seen is astounding but gradual. So in the first few weeks, you don't really see too much other than the ash laden ground and charred trees, and of course, some completely unburned areas. This is typical of fire. It skips around, and there's some havens that stay completely, sometimes closer to creeks, drainages, lakes, ponds. Those areas are a little wetter, and fire sometimes just skips over them and leaves them as these integrally the same habitats. But then other areas are very, very charred. The very first stages, when I say waves and waves and waves of life, is if I'm thinking about giant sequoias or Sequoia sempervirens, there's little green leaves that start poking out of the trees. It's called epicormic branching or flushing in the case of some trees, which means that they literally flush with green. They're literally bringing their nutrients back in with the help of their leaves. If they need it, they need food. So they put out these leaves really quickly. It starts happening within the first few months, and then after one rainy season, it's in full swing. In the case of the totally charred trees, the beetles fly in. They got smoke detectors, antennae, they fly in. And so that's that wave that's not really seen that much. They fly in, they lay their eggs. It's all very quiet. The eggs, the larvae hatch out and they start wood-boring beetle larvae bore into these standing dead trees, which are called snag trees, sometimes stag trees. I love that. Stag trees, it sort of gets that, you get that impression of all these branches.
Sure. The shapes.
Right, the shapes. And then after that, the next wave is the woodpeckers that come in after the food, which is the larvae, the beetle larvae, the bark larvae, and the wood-boring larvae, which are bigger. And so you hear this tapping all over the trees. There's an art museum here in Petaluma, Sonoma County, that reflects on these burnt forests. And I asked one of the artists, have you ever heard that tap, 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 tap? She said, yes. Those are the woodpeckers. Because sometimes they're hard to see. They're so camouflaged.
Right.
And the following wave is a lot of the predators. Whether it's, the owls, it'll be the weasels that are really fast movers, the martins, the fishers, they're all weasels. And the smaller short-tailed, long-tailed weasels. And of course, when there's small mammals on the ground digging holes, and then there's going to be your bobcats, mountain lions, bears.
Right.
Deer come in to forage on the fresh new growth that's happening. So it's just, like a wake-up call. It's a reset button, if you will,
Hmm.
for us to try to reset itself, to start
Hmm.
again,
Yeah.
and everything responds.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, maybe you could speak a bit about your movie, In Search of the Spot of Gold. It seems a
Nichols.
perfect segue to that film, your short film.
Yeah, thanks. About 2014, I started surveys in post-fire forests from all the way up in Lassen, all the way, which is the northern California, all the way down south to Sequoias, which is the mountains that are much closer to where you are in LA. And those forests had one quintessential factor, which was they were recent burns, the first,
Hmm.
maybe first 8, 9 years after a fire, sometimes 2 years after a fire.
Uh-huh.
And we were surveying for black-backed woodpeckers, and I just thought my own first impression was total reluctance about getting in there because it looked like a very stark landscape, not
Mhm.
really supporting new
Right.
life, not at all. And
Right.
so I thought, I can't understand what we will really find here. Well,
Right.
within days, I
Uh-huh.
was sort of taking my words back because
Hmm.
the very first day of the surveys, we found a black-backed woodpecker and we found her nest. And I
Hmm.
thought, okay, so these dead trees are houses, basically. They're
Right.
housing complexes for the wild. And thereafter, I followed other surveyors led by two of the scientists, Dr.
Mhm.
Chad Hansen and Tanya Chi, mentors and sort of leaders in these surveys, very, very dedicated to how do you find the blackback? How do you find
Hmm.
the secret? You have to be very patient. You can't really just like chase it.
Right.
You have to kind of watch. I mean, if you start running, kind of
Yeah.
lose it because
Yeah.
it's flying. So it's going to
Yeah.
be a winner every time. So you
Sure.
just sit still and figure out kind of
Hmm.
which way it's going, especially if it has something in its beak. If it has food in its beak, you're made. Because if
Hmm.
it's not eating it, that means it's delivering it.
Hmm.
Either it'll be delivering to a mate, it could
Hmm.
be, or to very young black-backed woodpecker chicks.
Hmm.
And so that's how we find the nest. And if you've seen the black-backed wood searching for the gold spot, the wild after wildfire, you'll see a lot of people as soon as they start playing the caller, which is part of the protocol, and the bird comes and checks you out. Who is this? And then protocol says that he'll probably go back to his nest if he's nesting. And females also both of them are very territorial. They'll fly back to the nest, and they think that you can't see them because they're just so blended in and they're not used to somebody following them. You keep a little distance, in fact, quite a distance, and birds are differently tolerant. Sometimes they're very shy in the sense that, oh gosh, if they see you
Right.
anywhere
Right.
within 50 feet, then they get
Furtive.
nervous.
Uh-huh.
And other birds, if you just sit tight, sit really quiet and small, maybe 50 to 75 feet away, yeah, they just sort of treat you as part of the background, and you're not gonna. This is some small bear, just sort
Hmm.
of grooming itself, and they just don't. I don't know what they're thinking, but I'm assuming if you're super still and quiet and low to the ground, the logic is you're not moving, so they're fine. And so this was a wonderful experience of finding these beautiful habitats, and then of course the fact that these beautiful habitats are treated the way I treated them the way I first saw them, which is nope, they're not beautiful and they're wastelands and nothing's going to happen here and we need to log them.
Right.
So that is the vast majority of beliefs right now. One, we need to log them because otherwise they'll burn up again. Or two, we need to log them because when they regrow back, they will burn up again. So either way, these burn forests don't have a status as forests. They're kind of like the pariahs of the forest, if you will. So that was
Not to the living beings who inhabit it, right? So that's the thing is whose priority is it?
yeah.
Oh
And
boy.
actually since that time I found so much more than the black-backed woodpeckers and on the other birds that are shown in the film.
Well, the film is an amazing testament to life in the forest, like you say, in the post-fire forest. And I wonder if you could speak about then segue to your other film, The Monster, talking about what happens with the clear cutting and the thinning and the responses to fire to this landscape that people assume is dead or bleak and not quote unquote useful except for creating biomass. And maybe you could speak more about The Monster. That
Yeah. So there's a small clip online. It's called Monster on the Horizon. And
Monster on the Horizon.
yeah, and of course, for short, I do call it Monster, just like what you because it's like Monster, what? Who?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
gets,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it came from one of the interviews with Gary Hughes, Biofuel Watch. And he just said, look, the funny thing, well, it's not funny. It would have been funny if it was a joke or a cartoon. It's actually real. These trees are chewed up into either pellets or chips and then just thrown into a furnace as if they're coal
Hmm.
and then burned up. And so that's their fate. They live to be burned, or they are standing dead trees to be burned. And so he says it's just like a hungry monster
Hmm.
because it just never ends.
Right.
It's all about feeding the monster. The secondary task is managing the forest. The managing the forest becomes a servant to feeding the monster. The monster is the
Hmm.
one that's more, 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 me, more, more, more.
Yeah. The
And so
monster of consumption and electricity and energy, right?
yes, and that's a new thing. I mean, it's been around for a while in California that people, trees for electricity, only because the logic is that when an industry is processing for laminated wood or two by fours or whatever, other
Hmm.
products, then they have the waste material, they burn it in order to power themselves. So that might have been the start of it. It was years ago, but then it amplified and now it's got all these subsidies and now it's grown into this very hungry monster,
Hmm.
possibly, which is called the Golden State Natural Resources Project, which is
Hmm.
where, Dr. Shea Wolf and Gary and Matt Holmes and Gloria Alonso Cruz were featured, that small film, because they were all talking about the shock of experiencing people even thinking about extracting 1 million tons of acres of forest per year out
Per
of, uh,
year.
yeah, it sounds
Out of these, what are these snag forests, right? Which is what you're talking about, harboring all this life and regenerating the ecosystem in
that, yeah.
Oregon, Nevada, and California, correct?
Yes, and also for that they will be taking a mix of dead and live trees. They'll take a lot of live trees too.
Yeah, so that movie was very disturbing to witness because I had no idea about it. I'm sure a lot of people don't realize it that these trees that are still living are being turned into, not always, but I guess it de depends how you define dead or living tree. I mean, right? A
Right.
person could have that perception, but it is still living. Or I don't know, how would you really define? I know we know that there is actually such a thing as a dead tree that's not going to actually live again.
Yes. So the standing dead trees, the stags trees that are really dead, the woodpeckers and the
How?
other related, yeah, birds, owls, nuthatches, chickadees, etc.
Mhm.
They know it
Yeah.
because those are the ones that are typically easier to dig into. So that's where
Mm.
the homes are built. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
what actually happens is there are some snatchers, like sometimes a woodpecker's dug his nest and swallows come in, or even
Hmm.
starlings, sadly, or another woodpecker will come in. Ooh, I like this. I'm taking over. I'm bigger than you. So
Hmm.
that happens too. So it's really many, many different. And in fact, I've even seen documented Pacific fisher, which is a large weasel, this big as probably about the size of a raccoon or something. It snatched the pileated woodpecker old cavity and
Hmm.
then came snarling out when the woodpecker came back to the cavity. So, so everyone wants them. And
Hmm.
that's the dead
So,
trees.
so would you say the right advocacy for the trees and the snag forest is to just leave them alone to
Yes.
decompose naturally in accordance with nature cycles?
Absolutely. Yeah. The snag forests, at the very least, people need to leave wide expanses alone just to make sure to see the diversity, to experience that, just to understand it a little better. They're not even understood when they're logged. And also to see whether or not they experience fire the same way the next time around, because there's this idea that they'll just burn up in the fire, but they actually burn very similarly to, live trees. So just the idea of a clear cut after fire, it just seems so misplaced. It's sort of like the management is really far behind the
Mhm.
science. The science
Yeah.
is like, you know,
Hmm.
jogging ahead, full speed, and discovering all these things. But the management is sort of plodding along pretty
Hmm.
like 10 to 20 years behind. So,
Yeah.
and then there's the live trees, there's thinning out live trees, which is happening, right next to all the standing dead. You'll be, ooh, but those are alive. But you know what? They don't look healthy. We'll take them, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, but it's more just industry. Would you say it's more of a profit-driven motive than an actuality? Because I know you said it's actually the way the trees are thinned, it's actually more destructive than it is beneficial to the ecosystem.
Yes, they're killing a whole lot more trees. Actually, the amount of trees that are killed is more than the trees killed from fire itself. It's so much right now. There's huge numbers killed. And so it's definitely industry and it's definitely profit, but it's also subsidies. It's
To do this,
yes,
to log
government-based subsidies are sort of feeding it because otherwise biomass industry it's not necessarily going to stand on its own feet without the subsidies.
subsidies. Got it.
Yeah.
Maya, we're going to take a break right here and come back to talk more about what happens in the post-fire forest for good and for ill. So we'll be right back, listeners.
You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org or socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. That's patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today you're listening to The Wild After Wildfire, Evolving Our Response to Fire, with host Carrie Kim and guest Maya Khosla, wildlife biologist, writer, poet, and filmmaker. This is a clip from Regeneration After Fire, Conversations with Dr. Chad Hansen, author of Smokescreen, by Maya Khosla.
Fire does not destroy the forest. Fire restores forests. The first spring after the fire, and for many springs after that, you see a complete transformation and an enormous density of natural conifer regeneration. And there's very, very little mortality of these conifers. Fire-killed trees then fall and become down logs. Native shrubs germinate. All of these things create very, very important habitat for wildlife. So my question is, why are we still suppressing backcountry fires? Why are we doing these post-fire logging operations at huge expense to taxpayers based upon these misrepresentations that these areas don't regenerate with conifers? The fact is that fire is not destroying the forests, but logging sure is.
So, Maya, I don't know if there's anything more you would like to say about how we change what's happening. How do we cultivate more respect for the snag forests and educate people so that this logging industry and the biomass industry is not just kind of taking place on our watch?
Yeah, it's going to be like this critical mass of awareness. How I think of critical mass is kind of funny that there was this sort of group of bikers in San Francisco and they call themselves critical mass, I think.
Mhm, mhm,
Anyway, so there was so many more bikers that would take over the roads on certain days, on certain evenings. And I think, and then they are a phenomenon, we have to reach a critical mass. We have to get to that level of awareness there's so much joy and there's so much deep exploration and experience out
mhm,
there that it's unmistakable and it's becomes sort of a growing phenomenon in the public, which it isn't right now. There's a
mhm,
lot of amazing stuff going on, even in the giant sequoias after the Castle Fire, Windy Fire, Canby Complex Fire. And it's we just need to get that critical mass still.
mhm, mhm. When you say there's amazing things happening, are you meaning biologically, ecologically? Is that what you're meaning when you say that?
Yeah,
things
yeah,
happening.
there's this just astonishing like I think
The
KNP complex
regeneration.
regeneration after it's been now 4 years since the KNP complex fire. The trees, some of the little tr young trees are getting almost as tall, if not taller, than
Mm-hmm.
I am right now. I mean, it's astounding regeneration in the areas that burned more intensely. It's
Uh-huh.
those areas it sparked this idea of like there was so much sunshine, there's so much
Mhm.
there's this uh fertilizer, the nutrients are back into the soil and they're all locked in for now. But then
Mhm.
the coming of rain and these little sprouts start happening. Some of those little seedlings are growing. We just even saw seedlings growing right out of the pine cone. Oop, I'm just,
Mhm.
this is
Right.
where I am and this is where
Yeah.
I'm growing. But some,
It's like this golden opportunity. Living in Anthropocene times and the things that we're talking about with life evolving at an incredible pace, especially with technology and becoming more abiotic in many ways, and that deep connectedness to nature is very different now, within and without from ancient times, of course. What are the ways you see to actually encourage people to be back in this communion with the living forest versus this estrangement from nature? Um, because that feels so important, just like your movie, to reconnect with that life from the
yeah,
forest.
I mean, there's so many ways and exciting ways to do this. And some of them include, you found Elemental. Elemental, of course, is doing pretty well. It's being remade, by the way, right now.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure there'll be previews of that because of the LA fires.
Sure.
Anyway, to contact folks who are in the middle of these deep explorations out in the field, because any number of people can join, and
Mhm.
the world is at your feet because not too many people are exploring these areas yet.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
mean,
Mhm.
we wish we would get to a stage where like, oh my gosh, there's so many people exploring. Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
become so popular, right?
Yeah,
And that would
yeah,
be awesome.
yeah.
But it's not happening yet. So it's the way to find out would be, to just check it out online. Like what you did with the film or several films, and then just contact those people, and I'll surely be able to give you a couple of the secret locations where you can find some pretty amazing stuff. And it's just as I said, the world's at your feet, and everything is going to be different each year. So you
Sure.
will never return to the same forest. It will
Mhm.
always be this burgeoning of life
Mhm.
that you're
Mhm.
returning to.
It's amazing. Would you say that the average person today, like just post the fires here, the Eden fires, the Palisade fires, would you say that the average person values their home more than the forest? Because maybe it's an unfair question, but it seems to be that's what it's coming down to, the forest or your home. What are we willing to give up for the forest and the life within it for it to continue?
Well, I think that the great news on that is that there doesn't have to be a choice between home and forest.
Hmm.
You can actually have both. I mean, I hate to get too dark about this, but I'll just rest on this point for a few minutes with a
Hmm.
couple of different facets of the point. Home hardening and defensible space has been receiving all of 5% of state budgets, that are given to wildfire. So
Wow.
maybe there's a brand new report that I can send you, and it's down to 1%.
Oh my goodness.
So what's the 99% going to? It's going to logging efforts, thinning
Oh,
efforts, vegetation clearance efforts, and related management tasks. And sort of biomass, because it's called renewable energy, it gets lumped into that. It's all been supposed to be beneficial. So,
right.
that's where more in any given year, more than 90% of these dollars are going dedicatedly not to home hardening or defensible space. And I'm sure you've seen cases of where the LA fires succeeded, people succeeded in protecting their
Protecting their
places
homes. Sure.
with
Yeah.
certain very textbook features, the tempered
Mhm.
glass, the eaves, the clean roofs, the metal around the 5 foot sacred space where nothing, no bushes, no vegetation within that area.
Mhm.
the vents, screens on vents, or no vents at all. In some cases, no vents at all. I was surprised to see that. I hadn't seen that before.
Mhm.
But these features people knew. Either they lost their homes or they were clever enough, they figured it out. And those are homes surrounded by, sadly, homes that
Right. What?
didn't do those. They don't have to be that expensive. So the deal is, if the state supported jobs, and that was like a lot more job, believe me, it's, when you have a big equipment operator and, a couple people on the ground, that's less jobs than, with vegetation management than, hardcore defensible space and home hardening, because that's pretty much very careful hand work.
Mhm. Right,
People will
right, right.
talk about what they do around their homes, and it's all hand work. So if
Mhm.
you give those jobs at the state level, if it's at least, let's start with 50-50, not
Sure.
1%,
That's
99, or
well, it's shocking to see that it would even become lower because when you said 5%, now it's 1%. I mean, it's amazing, especially with the extent of fires that we've had.
Yeah, so I don't think people need, I mean, it's people are in, complete. I was in shock after the 2017 fire. The Coffee Park was destroyed across the 101 freeway. It was not even on the side of the where the Tubbs fire came down. It was on the other side of the freeway, of
Hmm.
a multi-lane freeway. So, and of course the embers drove in, flying across the freeway. So we are shell shocked with this news, but the good news is we don't have to make the choice. That choice needs to be, the government needs to be a little more equitable in terms of like home hardening defensible space money and jobs, where
Hmm.
much needed jobs, versus like constant vegetation management in areas where they may in areas may burn fast and very intensely and hot, and it has happened. Thinned
Hmm.
areas have burned that way. So, that's the throw of the dice versus home hardening and defensible space. That's like a sure way. You are assured of your much higher chances of your home surviving fire.
Surviving, yeah. I wonder if you could talk about the languaging around fire because we know there is so much, especially in mainstream media, so much of it is kind of this militaristic languaging. It's always you're battling. We have firefighters, my kumuhula, and she said really the word would be more fire tender, not firefighter. Why is it that we're always fighting the fire? And then there's all the other string of words that are always kind of in this negative connotation. It's always destruction. It's always horrible. The fire is terrible. And so I wonder if you could speak to that. And it's even in the terms hardening the home and defensible space, it still has this kind of militaristic tone of control. It's not really an inviting terminology. And I think that's
Mhm.
part of our just the cosmological way we would apprehend fire. It's affecting us by the way we speak about it.
Yes, absolutely. This language has to change. The war on fire,
Mhm.
the fact that these military planes being used to discharge all that very toxic. Now we're realizing it's really toxic smoke retardant.
Of
So
course.
we don't have a choice on that, but we've gone so far and deep into that. And you're right, defensible space and home harm, those are,
It sounds like a militaristic terms. I mean, it sounds like, why? Yeah, I'm sure there's other words that would say the same thing differently.
working with fire, tending fire guiders instead of firefighters, those are terms I would be drawn to. And also inviting fire in. Traditional fire can be invited in
Sure.
every
Hmm.
year up in far northeast of India. Now, I know that better than I know the traditional burning around here,
Here. Hmm.
although I visited the traditional burns around here. But in India, I mean, this is actually a practice that's probably the world over, but I would imagine you have cultures all over the world. But in far northeast of India, every single year they burn the bamboo forests
Hmm.
below the ridgetop homes
Hmm.
where the villages are typically
Hmm.
situated.
Right.
And so fire works its way up, and so there are bands, whole bands around hillsides of, I think there was this 300 meter, 200, 100 kind of thing. They
Hmm.
have, they circle the area with fire every year
Hmm.
dedicatedly, and that has a name. Like, for example, June is cultivation fire, then there's hunting fire, and then
Ah,
this one has a long name that I really need to
okay.
learn
For the
again.
purpose of the fire, right.
For
Uh-huh.
the home har for home, well, home hardening.
Uh-huh.
for the purpose of, inviting fire into the land before a big fire comes over
Mm-hmm.
and potentially gets to the homes. So
Mm-hmm.
they invite fire there. I mean, that's a old traditional practice. It's been
Mm-hmm.
just it's so old. It has songs associated with it. That's
Mm-hmm.
how old it is.
Beautiful.
You know.
Right,
And
right.
so I recorded the songs. Yeah, I'm surrounded by fire, and people are just sort of the whole village. I mean, all the youngsters come in, the old elders are the ones who start the lighting, and then the
Mm-hmm.
youngsters
Mm-hmm.
kind of follow in
Right.
that path. It's a
Mm-hmm.
very ritual. It's a very
Sure.
ritualized.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is a recognition and a
Right.
reciprocal
Mm-hmm.
relationship. I see you, fire. I'm going to answer you with fire, and this is how we're going to live and coexist together. We'll be
Mm-hmm.
safer this way, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've even seen firefighters up in Oregon who do that or who
Right.
practice
They
that around their
understand that.
home.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sacred fire is not a strange, it's not a foreign terminology. People have heard that, sacred fire. We know, of course, indigenous peoples the world over, as you said, have had these relationships with fire. Fire is an ancestor, a relative, a teacher. It's not a foe. It's not an enemy to be subdued or controlled. And so I think it's the same way we speak about rivers or that the rivers are channelized and it's trying to control these forces of nature and
Mhm.
the Anthropocene and the human domination over nature. So it's all tied into that. But
I did want to mention one story I read, and I don't know what the outcome has been, but the Tongvas, you mentioned homage to the people, and they had a 1 acre property that I'm sure you know, right? It was saved from the fire, but they were trying to burn right before, and they were
mhm.
not given the permissions and permits. I think one shed did burn, but they seemed fairly confident in that news item that
Right.
the rest of them, because there was clay tile roofs and very and
Uh-huh.
stucco, and
Right.
they had removed
Materials.
eucalyptus from
Hmm.
the area. They had done a lot of work. They had incorporated oak into the habitat because it's more traditional.
Uh-huh.
So all those things were done. And then, my understanding is those homes have stayed. They
Hmm.
survived the fire. So even though, they weren't able to burn, even though, they didn't get those permits, but
It's really unbelievable. But we just keep praying for those changes to happen because we know there's much to learn from indigenous peoples and them also reclaiming those traditions of their cultural burning where
yes,
they had them,
yes.
I wonder what you would like to say about fire becomes a scapegoat for humans out of balance. That's what I was saying about the terrible fire. You just hear that it's terrible, it's horrible, it's so destructive. But you never hear about the terrible humans and what we're doing to create these situations or these scenarios for fire, whether it's a wildfire from sort of the way we've handled climate change and how we've tended to the soil in a wrong way, or urban fires and where we building in fire zones, building too close, building with toxic materials. I mean, the list goes on and on. So how to change again, not allowing fire to be the scapegoat for our own behaviors and finding a place of accountability for humans.
There is such a thing as watching the weather when people get careless with fire. And well, I know that the power lines are definitely part of it there.
Right.
And,
Sure.
as they are over here. They have caused many. But there are some mistakes that people make. There's several fires that have started tragically. Fireworks started,
Right. Hmm.
few
Hmm.
of the fires. My understanding is possibly would have started or at least smoldered until Jan 7th, the fires that was that at least one of the fires. So it's apparently close to, I don't know, way more than 50%. I've heard numbers like 85% of the fires are lit by some form of activity,
Human activity, right?
human activity, and or power lines. Power lines are which are not safe. They knock about against each other and known to spark. And on a
Right.
windy day, those sparks travel.
Hmm.
And yeah, so there's a lot of those fires, we're not seeing just so much. If we could just see lightning, if we could just see lightning fires, natural fires, traditional
Right.
fires, if
Right.
those were the fires we had, we wouldn't have this.
Sure.
Because
Yeah.
yeah, these are not the natural fires that you
Right.
think of, you know.
Would
Yeah.
you say, I mean, thinking about the fires here, the recent fires here, and they keep calling them wildfires, but I
Mhm.
feel it's a misnomer to even call it a wildfire.
Yes, you've nailed it. Because
And that kind of brings the terror, so people are afraid of fire that involves trees, or there's becomes this enemy again. And it demonizes fire by calling it a wildfire instead of where's the human in that? Where's our culpability in this? Because we are doing things that are actually creating these situations.
yes,
Even with the
yes.
winds, to have these high intensity 100-mile-an-hour winds, that did not happen overnight. That is something that has happened the way we have transformed the climate of this planet.
There's definitely a climate signal going on. There's no two ways about it. The January Santa Ana like that, and also the ferocity of it, and the fact that perhaps the length of this fire season is
Mhm.
growing. You know,
Right.
you
So we
just
don't have a season anymore, right? It's
it's
like,
not even, yeah, come on, January fire, December fire in Colorado
Mhm.
around the Christmas time. So I really think that there are climate signals involved there. The higher the temperature, the hotter it is, the more the erratic weather patterns start. And then, of course, those few days when something torches and it spreads, and then it's out of control all of a sudden. So most I think that we just have so much to do with that.
Right. And not covering the soil and how what we've interrupted the hydrological cycle and, we've interrupted the rain cycle. So there's so many pieces that are happening beforehand, and that will change the intensity of fires, the frequency of fires, all these things. On that note, we are going to take another break and we will come right back to talk more about the living forest.
Yeah.
You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org or socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. That's patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today you're listening to The Wild After Wildfire, Evolving Our Response to Fire, with host Carrie Kim and guest Maya Khosla, wildlife biologist, writer, poet, and filmmaker.
We're back with Maya Khosla, a wildlife biologist and documentary filmmaker, poet, and writer. But, I wondered if you could maybe educate listeners on the difference between these different types of forest landscapes that you've mentioned, an intact forest, a thinned forest, a high severity burn forest, and a commercially clear cut forest. What is important to know between those different types of forest?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about all of those, and I want to also give you a quick sort of preliminary comment about non-forests because it's so important to the LA area. LA area was the fires were now there's a colleague of mine, Brian Baker, who's done extensive mapping. You might have heard about him because it's quite a few of his maps have been published in the media or in articles in scientific
Mm-hmm.
journals. And he did an estimate of the percentage of forest in LA fires. It was about 3%. So this is not anything to do with forests down there. It was beautiful chaparral plus, which is
Uh-huh.
used to high heat burns. That's how it regenerates. If it's
Uh-huh.
unless it's every year, then the chaparral gets destroyed. But that's how chaparral burns. But forest fires, so forests, the different types of forests, there's intact forests that are, it can be anything from an old growth forest that has
Mm-hmm.
just got this beautiful feeling of moisture as soon as you enter it. Your
Mm-hmm.
feet sink,
Right.
maybe a few
Into the sponge.
inches,
Mm-hmm.
like it's like a sponge. It's like you're
Right.
stepping on springs, is what Dr. Bev Law told me during an interview. She's up in
Uh-huh.
Oregon. And
Mm-hmm.
so those intact forests are these mature old growth, beautiful forests that have not been touched for a long time. I
Mm-hmm.
also think of intact forests as ones that have been logged maybe a century ago or less, and
Mm.
they've grown up and
Uh-huh.
regained themselves, grown into themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They've
Mm-hmm.
gotten to that state of maturity, maybe
Mm-hmm.
100 years or 80 years old. And they
Mm-hmm.
have some of the features
Mm-hmm.
of an old growth, a mature forest. It's
Mm-hmm.
got the snags of fallen wood
Right.
that sort
Mm-hmm.
of is like keeps moisture in it like a sponge, and things are even growing, ferns are sprouting out of it. Little
Uh-huh.
seedlings find their
Uh-huh.
little roots and they start sprouting out of it, and it's gradually sort of melts into the soil with the help of all these mycorrhizae fungi. You can actually, if you pick it up, you can see these stringy mesh
Mm-hmm.
type of structure of the mycorrhizae. And then there's oyster mushrooms that grow right up. So, and there's conch shell mushrooms. You can just see this factor in there of the maturity and all the cycles of different beings that are contributing to that maturity. And so those intact forests have not been touched for maybe not forever, but
Right.
they've been touched
Right.
for but they're still, sort of regaining
Mm-hmm.
themselves in terms of
Mm-hmm.
maturity. And the thin forests, I want to see about the mature and intact and the snag forests, the intact snag forests, and mature old growth forests. They all are very high biodiversity. You'll hear layers and layers and layers of bird sounds. You'll
Mm-hmm.
see animal prints of various kinds. There'll be smells that you'll be like, oh, better not go there. I can tell this probably,
Uh-huh.
this is the mountain lion
Yeah.
habitat or something.
Mm-hmm.
So those, you've got layers of life in there. And then you get to thin forests, and recently, really recently, thin forests, just to be honest and frank, the soil has been ripped up because it's machinery, and the
Mm-hmm.
machinery is going back and
And they're
forth.
compacting the soil. Uh-huh.
Yes, so it's been smashed and almost pulverized in some cases to dust. So when you drive on it, you better beware because there's going to be dust filling every nook and
Uh-huh.
cranny of your car.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If, it's probably not a good idea to drive in there at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's that. And there's a silence there. Now, I had an intact forest as part of a tour group that I've been leading for several years up in Mono Lake area. And next to it, I saw, Hartley Springs
Mm-hmm.
prescribed burn. And I thought,
Uh-huh.
I'll go check this out. It was not that I could see. I could not find where the burn was. It was
Mm-hmm.
probably some pile burn somewhere that I couldn't find, but it was
Mm-hmm.
clear cut, or swaths were clear cut, maybe 1 acre or so, and it was interspersed with trees. Like they had these regular intervals, like you would be in a garden or something.
Right, right,
And the soil was just hammered, and some of the trees were deeply nicked because, operate equipment going just
right.
really
Getting
close
striking the
back and
tree. Or,
forth,
yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
then it just nicks the trees. So no birds. Okay, sorry. One tanager was what I heard. I remember one
Lonely,
western.
one lonely tanager.
Yes, and this was bird breeding season, nesting season. So I can imagine that those thin forests are really stripped bare, quite literally. They call them cleaned up, but they're stripped bare of the richness of life. And then there's a full-on clear cut,
Mm-hmm.
which is, may as well be a parking lot of dust.
Yeah.
There's nothing there, and nothing can.
Nothing, nothing to hear. That's like the silent spring forest where there's no sound
There isn't, yeah.
except machinery. So Maya, I wanted to shift gears a little bit to back to this word firewise. What does the word firewise encompass?
I mean, to me, the word firewise, it's a wonderful internal rhyme there, and it encompasses so many of the rituals that I know,
Mm-hmm.
including the rituals of nature
Right,
that
sure.
knows, recognizes the power of fire,
Mm-hmm.
not just with trees and shrubs and flowering herbaceous plants growing back, but with all the instincts of the animals that come back after. I mean, they go away, they vacate, they go into creeks, or they go into deep canyons to find safe havens
Mm-hmm.
during, and then after they're wise enough to come right back to seek out a territory, a new spot in this landscape that's had a major been a reset button, like a reset. It's all reset. It's all new. So they stake out there. They are just as firewise as anyone else. I think about firewise in the human terms. I think about it as what what we should be called upon to listen to, which is traditional practices,
Mhm.
practices that have been alive and well for generations of
Mhm.
elders
Right.
and folks who understand that fire has always been a part of the land. And then
Right.
this is a firescape, really.
Mhm.
And also being wise about being on the home front, fire-wise on the home front. You know, um, there are people who talk about, I have friends who talk about how did a great job trimming the tree away from the home, but then you've got a shrub growing right next to the home, or
And they lean
right
up
up, or
against
you
the
got
house. Yeah.
a
Yeah.
wooden fence or a cord of wood right
Mhm.
outside,
Right against the
your
house. Yeah.
broom leaning again. So it's really about thinking like an ember.
Mm.
What's an ember? Firewise to me on the home front is about let's think like an ember in an ember cast. What's an ember in an ember cast going to do in terms of lodging and possibly growing? And then
Mhm.
growing and then,
Mhm.
becoming flames. What's
Could,
that going to do?
I wonder if you could speak about the creek fire, because I understand that in the creek fire, even though it was close to the forest, that some 90% of the homes survived. I don't know if there were some unique conditions around that fire that made that so, but if you could speak to that.
The creek fire is the one with the helicopter rescues up near the Mammoth Pool.
Mm,
Um,
I'm not sure, but I know it was almost 78,000 acres burned. But that's just what I had heard, that majority of those homes survived, but they were close to the forest.
A lot of the homes around Shaver Lake and Huntington Lake are pretty much right on the lake. I've been
Mhm.
all around the Creek Fire really recently, have some amazing stories from there, which I'd love to share. And so I would imagine that once the rescues came and people were taken care of, that there would be the ability to fight that fire with an enormous reservoirs, two
Mhm.
enormous
Mhm.
reservoirs of water
Right.
that so yes, I remember this very clearly that there are a lot of homes that are standing there. I didn't really study a percentage, but that's impressive just to hear what
Right.
you're saying. And I've seen that because I've been all around both the lakes
Mhm.
during surveys, and they were, I would imagine a lot of them did
Had their homes
practice
prepared. Yeah,
home
these
safety.
practices that you're talking about. Yeah, fire safety practices.
And then I would imagine a lot of them didn't, but there were big neighborhoods where the access to water combined with the
Mhm.
winds, etc. So the fire began north of there and it
Mhm.
traveled south. It's possible that there will always be days when the fire slows down. It might begin fast with
Right.
a really windy day, but if
Mhm.
there's enough between Mammoth Pool where I think there were no homes,
Mhm. Mhm.
basically camping ground. That's why people were running down
Right.
to the lake to,
Mhm. Mhm.
sort of like for water, for the
Right.
safety of water, and then
Mhm.
waiting for the helicopter rescues. And so I think from what I remember, it was definitely a few days before it came down to Shaver Lake and
Mhm.
Huntington Lake,
Mhm.
respectively. So that would have given them time for preparation. Time for preparation is everything.
Mhm.
Wind factor is everything, access, all these factors.
You yourself having gone through fire, being evacuated, um, what and all that you know and that you've studied and that you've witnessed, would you be any different if the same fire were to emerge now? I mean, what would change? What has changed in your own relationship with fire, given what your work is and your efforts have been?
So I want to start right there from the body because I'm a toxicologist. And one of the first things I did during the 2017 Sonoma Complex fires is I read up on what is elements of nature, what are the herbs that will help you detoxify because we were all experiencing that smoke. That smoke is something all encompassing. Everybody's going to experience it.
Mhm.
And then how do you clean up and when do you open your windows, etc. So those were the things I started with after a bit, I had evacuated. I had no idea if my home was going to be there or not. I had forgotten my mom's saris, the traditional dress. I just felt terrible that I'd forgotten them. I thought, okay,
Mm.
well, if I lose my home,
Uh-huh.
that's something I can never get back. And I had some photo albums, etc. But one of the first things I was thinking about was detox, and I remember writing about this, but I know turmeric was high on the list.
Mm.
And I just remember mustard and the brassica family, like for example, broccoli and Brussels sprouts.
Mhm.
They were in the they fed into the and nourished the enzymes in your body that detoxify smoke.
Mhm. Mhm.
That because it's a complex of
Yeah.
polyaromatics. And
Mhm.
so they are specialized in that. So I thought, oh, so that was one of the first things I remember thinking of. And I said, that's where I go, is that, how do you prepare yourself so that you can stay calm and stay
Right.
nourished and
Right.
be well through it. A lot of, hydration and all that. And then the other thing I do now naturally is I always have a suitcase. And it doesn't have to be near the door, but it's got some clothes that I think, okay, if this is it,
Mhm.
then this, and then the backpack and the computer. So those are the things that happened to me after the fire came like 2 miles away.
Right.
And obviously I was luckier than others. It didn't end up right
Mhm.
at the door. But we had a lot of other related events.
People, yes,
There are
sure,
people
yeah.
and
Yeah.
friends
And
who
people
lost
that you know,
homes.
community, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you feel that fire, you've said that fire is one of the most misunderstood forces of nature, and why would you say that is?
Well, I think we talked about the fact that earlier on that you said there's so much demonization happening in our language. Our language is so prepared to demonize fire due to these tragedies, and we're not really encompassing the fact that, gosh, only 5% of the state's money and probably most likely less is being spent on efforts to really, really prepare communities. The efforts are far from home. So,
Right.
I
Mhm.
mean, I just think of it being something that's overly demonized, and it's the tragedies are eclipsing. It's almost like a total solar eclipse. You
Mm.
can't see the sun.
Mhm.
It's a total solar eclipse of understanding. It's like a
Mhm.
total solar eclipse of our understanding because there is nothing about fire that we can see. It is eclipsed in
Mhm.
its entirety by fear.
Mhm. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel it also that fire somehow there's like a psychic trigger that it people think of it as death. I mean, truly, you think of the funeral pyre or these traditions or witch burning. I mean, you could go into all these different things that have happened throughout history connecting fire with death. And so I think somehow subconsciously there is that fear, not for everybody, because I know with indigenous peoples, they grow up in a different way with fire. Many of them do. They learn to relate with fire from a very young age, especially those who have, cultural burning as a tradition. So
Yeah.
it's a learning and it's also an unlearning as well, like unlearning the fear. I think, I would love for you to speak about Firewise. I know we're getting shorter on time, but if you could speak about your other short film, Firewise, The Scientists Speak.
Oh yeah, I started something and then I still have it has to still grow. But what I really wanted to do was to bring firefighters, retired firefighters, scientists, fire scientists, ecologists together
Mhm.
to this common ground, a
Mhm.
common ground, to find that common ground in the idea of what fire brings and what fire takes, you know.
Mhm.
And I think many people, including First Nation people, are a part of that. First Nation people, members of tribes here and abroad, and certainly indigenous tribes in India are very much a part of that. What what is it that we need to have that are the basics of a common ground that we need to have around fire? And we need to have it now. We can't
Mhm.
really wait too much, but of course, that was what I was trying to explore around the Firewise. And then of course now I'm working on something else to complete something else. But yeah, that concept still remains very close to me, and I'm still in the process of exploring.
Well, that's a kind of a continuing project, is it not?
It is, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that conversations continue. I don't know if you are interviewing people here post these fires, or is more your focus is more with fires that are not urban fires.
Following a story by Dr. Chad Hansen on Wrightwood, the bridge fire last year. It happened last year. I think 99% of the homes, I think 99% of the homes were still standing. I went out there and I did interview people and asked them what
Okay.
they did. And there were people whose fences was singed. The fire
Oh,
came all the way up to a low fence that was singed, and it didn't come to the home. So that was very interesting to me. And yes, I did definitely visit. There was so much that people were doing to caretake before that fire came up. And also we have to also realize and be humbled by the fact that wind speed, weather, cool, warm weather, all these variations play into, so we are second. We in a high wind situation like 100 miles, 80 miles an hour. We had 80 miles an hour here. You don't you can't fly into that. You can't fly that. It's just not possible. So there's something humbling about that those are the factors that really determine things. And so you do whatever you can to prepare before that happens, long before that happens. Yeah.
yeah. And then the hope is that the fires here are an opportunity for ecosystem restoration and to do right things by the soil so that we create different conditions on the ground, in the soil itself.
There'll be so much beauty coming out of chaparral that has not burned in a long time and has a chance to recoup because it's reborn after fire. So I've been shown, Brad Baker has shown me some of those systems down there, and it's beautiful after fire. Beautiful. A few seasons.
Maya, thank you so much for joining us today. I would love for you to close with one of your poems related with fire, whatever you feel is appropriate.
Now you can set down your fears. A sweep of brightness raises the mountain tops from sleep. As if on cue, a rush of breath answers the stuff of ages, the essentials, lands and gurgling waters, awakened by silences, rising. Once the flames have fallen, now you can set down your fears. You can see the tribes arriving, sprig by sprig, the forests unwrapping layers of light, the old and the new, shoulder to shoulder, ambers, reds, and greens, following internal instructions, lily, lupin, conifer, marking time, now the wild ones, with inner eyes drawing from the Pleistocene, arriving with the disposition of their ancients, mice, owls, foxes yipping, lines of pilgrims with the training, the shape and scent of paths mapped out. Now the mule deer, the lions, all along they knew to arrive.
Beautiful. I love it. I love to hear about all of our relatives because they, in all of this fire talk, they get forgotten. And I'm so grateful for you to really shine a light on them, and their lives and how important their lives are and our interdependence with them. Yeah, all of the living beings of the forest. Could you share some of the links where people can find your films, find your writings, your poetry, just keep up with your projects?
I have a website, mayakhosla.com, and there's films, Monster on the Horizon and Peche are two films that are on Vimeo that just have these long names. And I do have Elemental is something I highly recommend
The
because
film.
primarily because there's a lot of heart in that film. There's a lot of concepts, a lot of, heady concepts like what to do and all that. But there's just a lot of heart in that film as well. And then searching for the gold spot, if you can find it online, it's the easy one. If you type searching for the gold spot, the wild after wildfires is my first documentation of post-fire, the beauty and life of post-fire forests.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I highly recommend that one because it helps people remember. I mean, the woodpecker's so beautiful, and just the way you capture the face. I mean, we really need to respect these ancestors, and some of us have never seen them, and so it's so beautiful to see what happens in the Snag forest. Yeah, the owls. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Maya, for your work and for bringing this other perspective and reminding us that of the beauty of fire and the sacredness of fire. And I think that's something that we all need to remember and to have that perspective coming in and a remembrance that we have always lived with fire. And it's a matter of coming back into balance with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to our guest, Maya Khosla, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been The Wild After Wildfire, evolving our response to fire. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Ecojustice Radio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show at Ecojustice Radio or SoCal350. A project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on all major podcast apps and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer, myself, Jack Eit. Co-host, Carrie Kim. And engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.